So what about other types of power? So China also has coal power. They have nuclear power.
The people's power.
Right. So how are those affected by this water crisis?
Well, everyone knows the people's power is unlimited, right? So that's not a problem.
That's true.
So hydropower, just to kind of give a sense of how enormous China's power sector is. So China has 350 gigawatts of hydropower, which is a giant fraction. I don't have the exact number, but I think it's maybe nearly half of global hydropower capacity. And that is only about 16% of China's overall power generation, right? So it's a chunk, right? It's a slice of the pie, but it's actually far from the biggest slice of the pie. The biggest slice of the pie remains coal.
Beautiful coal.
Beautiful coal. Thermal power, which is coal as well as natural gas or oil or any other fossil fuel that you're burning to turn a turbine and create electricity, that still accounts for about 70% of China's current power output. So when you think about where is China's power coming from, the first thing you should always be thinking about is coal, right? Coal is also very dependent on water. Why is it dependent on water? It's dependent on water at all stages of the process for mining, for washing coal, often for transporting coal from the mine to its end industrial or power use, often on rivers, on barges. And then it's also used for cooling. So in thermal power plants where parts of the plant get really, really hot, the way that you maintain their function is through cooling. Now, there are some ways that can be done with air, but because air cooling is less efficient and more expensive, most plants have been built in a manner to be water cooled. And in a world where water is abundant, you just, sit your plant on the nearest river or seacoast or lake, and voila, you have your water. The problem is when you have a water crisis, then you are literally left high and dry, right? And so these thermal power plants also have a direct knock-on impact during the water crisis. And so in extreme cases, the power output of these coal plants has to be curtailed, just like the hydropower is curtailed. And so those actually compound and become an even bigger problem. And that's even further compounded by the fact that if it coincides with, say, a heat wave, everyone turns up their air conditioner and the demand for power goes way up just as the supply is cratering, right? And that's often the kind of thing that leads to blackouts or to failures on the power grid due to these environmental factors. And it is both a chronic and an acute challenge that China is dealing with, and it's a challenge that's not going away.
Now, given that so much of China's energy is produced by coal, and that coal requires water for washing and mining. Now, you mentioned that the water used for cooling can often be cycled back, but if you're washing coal, like that just creates polluted water, right?
That's right.
What happens to that?
Quite literally dirty fact, right? That there are all kinds of industrial uses and, extractive industry uses of water that result in polluted supply. And, often it just, it goes into the nearest body of water or some kind of containment facility. And that is sort of the very unsatisfying answer of where polluted water goes, right? There are environmental regulations that require remediation or treatment in many cases. Those rules are sometimes followed, sometimes they're not. And then the water is not only essentially consumed or, useless after that, but of course it can also pollute the environment, right? And then cause problems in whatever locale that water has been dumped.
So it can pollute the soil too.
Exactly.
So this is really win-win-win because coal's polluting the air and the water and the soil. It's really kind of covering all the bases there.
Well, if you're looking for the pollution trifecta, you found it with coal, right? It has its
Wow.
Which is
dirty
great.
reputation for a reason.
It's great because, since China is a developing country, despite being the second largest economy in the world, according to their Paris Climate Agreement, they get to actually burn more coal and increase until 2030. And then maybe they'll start to cut back.
Yeah, until they change the deal.
Yeah. So are we headed to Dune, Arrakis, Desert Planet?
I was actually thinking Water World, but that's like a totally different premise.
Isn't that the opposite?
Yeah, but the problem isn't like the ocean levels on the Pacific coast of China might be rising slightly the way that it is globally, right? But that's saltwater, so you can't do anything with that. You have to. I mean, we're talking about a freshwater crisis, not a saltwater crisis, right?
I mean, it depends on the use, right? In most cases, it is a freshwater crisis. Certainly, the oceans are rising, not falling, right? So, anything that's on the coast that's using seawater is probably less of a threat. But there are some caveats to that. First of all, there are limited uses for seawater. Right? It can be used for cooling, but it certainly doesn't substitute for many freshwater uses like irrigation, certainly household use, things like that, right? You're not going to use seawater for that. So it has to be a usage that seawater can fulfill. Even the cooling issue can be a problem because this is less an issue with the ocean. It tends to happen more with rivers and lakes, but if the water warms up, say during a heat wave, it no longer has the same capability to cool, right? And so, if you're trying to cool something off by dumping a bucket of hot water on it, it's not going to do the job that a bucket of cold water would. And so it happened actually in many of the European countries that were impacted by the heat wave last summer that nuclear power stations, which are also rely on water to cool. Many of them that are sited on rivers actually had to cut back their production because the water wasn't cool enough to cool the plants. And you can have the same thing with coal. So you have temperature-related vulnerabilities even when you may actually still have water to use. And so that, in some cases, can also impact coastal seawater.
Now, speaking of coastal seawater, so like you mentioned Israel, that has a really acute, they have an ongoing water shortage, right? That they've had for 70 years, or probably forever. And Israel uses a lot of desalinization, which is basically taking salt water or brackish water, removing the salt through some process, and then that becomes potable water or drinkable water. So
exactly, yeah.
So how about China? Like China's got plenty of coast. There's still lots of salt water. Why not just solve the freshwater shortage by building lots of desalinization plants?
It's a great question. The answer is in part that China is doing that, right? There is some effort to increase desalination as a source of fresh water. The problem is there are some limits to that. Statistics that I've seen indicate there are about 20,000 desalination plants globally. The output of all of those global plants would be enough to provide only about 6% of China's water needs. So the scale of desalination that would have to be done to make a serious dent in the problem is just astronomical, right? It doesn't work well at large scale, right? You can do it in small countries or in cities, particularly if you're using that water use for, residential, household or office consumption. Because as I mentioned, those are much smaller sources of water demand than industry or agriculture, right? So you have that problem, right? It's simply the scale problem is big. There are other problems as well. It's really expensive. It happens to generate water only on the coast, right? So that it can be then difficult to transport that water to where it needs to go for its use, right? It still may not, your coastal water that you've desalinated isn't going to help you address your water scarcity in Anhui, right? Or Sichuan, right? The water's not in the right place. And one additional problem is the fact that desalination is incredibly power intensive, right? Electricity intensive. It takes a lot of energy. And so China is already facing a power crisis, right? So the question is, are they really going to divert their existing power capacity to desalination when they already don't have enough power to go around? So you're sort of robbing Peter to pay Paul if you take that approach, because it then exacerbates other problems they have that are, interlinked.